Let's place ourselves in a very specific room in the early 1930s. A man is sitting alone, looking at his uniform. It is heavy. It is weighed down by ribbons, stars, and metal. Two Congressional Medals of Honor, the Marine Corps Brevet Medal, the French Order of the Black Star. At this exact moment in history, the man looking at that uniform is the most decorated Marine in the history of the United States military. He has spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service. He has marched through the jungles of the Philippines. He has fought in the Boxer Rebellion in China. He has commanded troops in the blood-soaked mud of France during the First World War. He has intervened in Nicaragua, Honduras, Haiti, and Mexico. Men have bled for him. Men have died directly on his orders. He is a living legend of American military might. And, looking at those medals, he feels sick to his stomach. Because he realizes something brutal. He realizes that for over 3 decades, he was not a hero carrying the torch of democracy. He was a racketeer. He was a high-class, heavily armed muscle man for Wall Street, for the bankers, and for the industrialists. He looks at his career and realizes he was essentially a gangster for capitalism. Welcome, everyone. Today, we are opening up a remarkably thin, incredibly dangerous little book. It was published in 1935, and it is called War is a Racket. The author is that heavily decorated, deeply disillusioned man, Major General Smedley Darlington Butler. We are going to spend the next several hours dissecting this text. We are not going to look at grand geopolitical theories. We are not going to discuss the noble rhetoric of statesmen. We are going to look at the cold, hard, blood-stained balance sheet of global conflict. Let us step right into the opening pages. Butler does not waste time. He does not clear his throat with academic preambles. He hits you with the thesis in the very first sentence. War is a racket. It always has been. We need to linger on that word, racket. In the 1930s, that word belongs to Al Capone. It belongs to the mobsters shaking down corner stores in Chicago and New York. A racket is an organized criminal enterprise built on extortion, fraud, and violence. By deliberately choosing this specific word, a 2-star general is stripping away every flag, every parade, and every brass band from the concept of war. He is equating the foreign policy of a superpower to a mob shakedown. How does he define it? He tells us that a racket is easily recognized. It is something that is not what it seems to the majority of the people. Only a small inside group knows what it is really about. It is conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the very many. Let that sink in. The illusion is the point. The majority of the people, the public, the soldiers, the grieving mothers, believe the war is about something noble. They believe it is about saving the world for democracy. They believe it is about protecting the homeland. That is the marketing campaign. But the inside group knows the truth. The inside group is looking at the profit margins. Butler focuses intensely on the First World War to prove his point. He pulls back the curtain on the sheer volume of money moving through the system while millions of boys were dying in the trenches. He points out that before the World War, the United States had relatively few millionaires, but out of the blood and the mud of that conflict, at least 21,000 new millionaires and billionaires were created in the United States alone. 21,000. Where did that money come from? It did not come out of thin air. It came from the taxpayers. It came from Liberty bonds bought by ordinary citizens. And where did it go? It went straight into the pockets of the manufacturers. Butler describes the grim reality of this transfer of wealth. You have young men, stripped of their individuality, handed a rifle, and sent across the ocean to live in a trench filled with rats, mustard gas, and the rotting corpses of their friends. They are making $1 a day, less sometimes. And back home, the DuPonts, the steel magnates, the meat packers, the shoe manufacturers, they are pulling in profits of 300, 400, 800%. Butler highlights the sheer absurdity of the supplies ordered by the government. The war effort became a dumping ground for defective products and vast overproduction. He talks about the government buying millions of pairs of shoes that were completely useless. They bought enough mosquito netting to cover the entire state of Texas for a war fought in the freezing mud of northern Europe. They bought enough saddles to supply an army of cavalry long after the machine gun had made the cavalry horse completely obsolete. The people selling these things didn't care if the shoes fell apart in the rain. They didn't care if the meat they sold to the mess halls was rotting. They were getting paid by a government that was writing blank checks with the blood of its citizens as collateral. You force us to look at the transaction. In this racket, the costs are socialized. The costs are borne by the taxpayer who foots the bill, and by the soldier who pays with his limbs, his sanity, or his life. But the profits are entirely privatized. They are hoarded by the few who never hear the sound of artillery fire. We move now directly into the ledger books. Butler doesn't just throw around the word millionaire for shock value. He brings the receipts. He forces us to look at the math, because the math is where the racket actually lives. Let us look at the DuPonts. Before the First World War, from 1910 to 1914, their powder trust had an average annual profit of about $6 million. That is a very comfortable sum of money for the era. But then the guns open up in Europe. The world catches fire. Between 1914 and 1918, DuPont's average annual profit skyrockets to $58 million, nearly 1,000% increase. Think about what that actually means. Think about the product. They are manufacturing the explosives designed specifically to tear human flesh apart, to shatter bones, and to collapse earthen trenches on top of suffocating men. The executives in those boardrooms never smelled the cordite. They never choked on chlorine gas. They just watched the dividends multiply by 10. Butler goes down the list sector by sector. He looks at United States Steel. Their normal pre-war earnings were about $105 million a year. During the war years, that number surges to $240 million. Not bad for smelting the metal that forms the artillery shells raining down on the Somme. He looks at Anaconda Copper. Their profits jump from $10 million to $34 million. Utah Copper goes from $5 million to $21 million. But it isn't just the obvious instruments of death. The racket permeates everything. Butler points to the Central Leather Company. Before the war, they were pulling in a little over $1 million a year in profit. During the war, they pulled in $15 million a year, a 1,500% increase. Why? Because millions of young men needed boots to stand in freezing water until their feet turned black and gangrenous. The worse the conditions, the faster the boots rot. The faster the boots rot, the more boots the government has to buy. The more boots the government buys, the higher the dividends for the shareholders of the Central Leather Company. He even looks at the American Sugar Refining Company. Their profits tripled. The meat packers, their profits quadrupled. Every single component of keeping a soldier alive just long enough to be killed was monetized, optimized, and milked for every possible cent. Butler wants you to feel the agonizing friction between the abstract numbers on a balance sheet and the physical reality on the ground. The government was issuing Liberty bonds to the public, telling school children to save their pennies, telling housewives to ration their food to support the boys. And all that money, all that national sacrifice was being funneled directly into the pockets of corporations that were marking up their prices by 300, 400, 500%. How do they get away with it? That is the genius of the racket. They wrap the extortion in the flag. During a war, patriotism is weaponized against the public. If a citizen questions why the meat is rotting, or why the boots are falling apart, or why the copper costs so much, they are immediately silenced. If you question the profit margins of the industrialists, you're accused of questioning the war effort itself. And if you question the war effort, you're a traitor to the boys bleeding overseas. It is a perfect closed-loop system. The propaganda shields the profiteering from any public scrutiny. The people making the money sit on the war committees. They advise the government on what to buy, and then they sell those exact items to the government at heavily inflated prices. They are both the buyer and the seller. And meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, the bill for this massive transfer of wealth is coming due. But the boys in the trenches are not paying it with money. They pay with their nervous systems. They pay with their limbs. They pay with their sanity. Let us look at the actual transaction that takes place when a young man is pulled into this machine. Butler wants us to examine the bait and switch. You have an 18-year-old kid from a farm in Ohio or a textile mill in Massachusetts. How do you get him to walk into machine gun fire? You cannot simply tell him that he needs to go die so that a copper conglomerate can hit its quarterly earnings target. He would laugh in your face. So you build an illusion. You use the marching bands. You use the beautiful girls smiling from the parade floats. You use the clergyman preaching righteous fury from the pulpit. You use the politicians giving soaring speeches about saving civilization from the barbarians. It is a masterclass in psychological manipulation. You take a normal boy, you put him in a crisp uniform, you pin a badge on his chest, and you make him feel like a god. Then you put him on a boat. The moment that boat docks, the illusion evaporates. The brass bands disappear. The soaring speeches are instantly replaced by the relentless, deafening scream of artillery fire. The crisp uniform is immediately soaked in freezing rain, blood, and human waste. The boy from Ohio suddenly realizes that the glorious adventure is actually just an industrial slaughterhouse. And what is his compensation for this? Butler lays out the pathetic math. The soldier is paid roughly $30 a month, but he doesn't even see most of that. He's heavily pressured, almost forced, to send half of that money back home to his dependents because the government is absolutely not going to take care of his family while he's gone. Then, he's required to buy his own life insurance. He literally has to pay out of his own meager salary for the privilege of making sure his mother is not entirely destitute when he is inevitably blown apart. By the time the deductions are finished, the kid sitting in a trench full of rats and mustard gas is making pennies a day. He's making less than the cost of a cheap meal back in Chicago. Meanwhile, the executive who manufactured the defective boots rotting off that soldier's feet is buying a third vacation estate. But the financial insult is just the superficial layer of the racket. The true cost is extracted from the human body. Butler takes us by the hand and walks us into the veterans' hospitals long after the treaties are signed. This is where the real bill is presented. The parades are over, the ticker tape has been swept up, the public has moved on. But in these sterile, quiet wards, the war has never ended. Butler describes visiting these rooms and seeing men whose minds were completely shattered by the concussive force of high explosives and the unendurable, grinding terror of trench warfare. He sees men who flinch uncontrollably at the sound of a dropped tray. He sees men who haven't spoken a single word in years. He points to the boys who come back missing jaws, missing arms, missing eyes. The public doesn't want to look at them. The racket requires that the public ignores the carnage the moment the shooting stops. The men who survive, the ones who come back physically whole, find that the very jobs they left behind have evaporated. The factories that were desperate for their labor are now firing workers because the wartime contracts have dried up. The soldiers are handed a cheap ribbon, told they're heroes, and pushed out onto the breadlines. Butler wants you to feel the agonizing friction between the abstract numbers on a balance sheet and the physical reality on the ground. The government was issuing Liberty bonds to the public, telling school children to save their pennies, telling housewives to ration their food to support the boys. And all that money, all that national sacrifice was being funneled directly into the pockets of corporations that were marking up their prices by 3, 4, 500%. How did they get away with it? That is the genius of the racket. They wrap the extortion in the flag. During a war, patriotism is weaponized against the public. If a citizen questions why the meat is rotting, or why the boots are falling apart, or why the copper costs so much, they are immediately silenced. If you question the profit margins of the industrialists, you're accused of questioning the war effort itself. And if you question the war effort, you're a traitor to the boys bleeding overseas. It is a perfect closed-loop system. The propaganda shields the profiteering from any public scrutiny. The people making the money sit on the war committees. They advise the government on what to buy, and then they sell those exact items to the government at heavily inflated prices. They are both the buyer and the seller. And meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, the bill for this massive transfer of wealth is coming due. But the boys in the trenches are not paying it with money. They pay with their nervous systems. They pay with their limbs. They pay with their sanity. Let us look at the actual transaction that takes place when a young man is pulled into this machine. Butler wants us to examine the bait and switch. You have an 18-year-old kid from a farm in Ohio or a textile mill in Massachusetts. How do you get him to walk into machine gun fire? You cannot simply tell him that he needs to go die so that a copper conglomerate can hit its quarterly earnings target. He would laugh in your face. So you build an illusion. You use the marching bands. You use the beautiful girls smiling from the parade floats. You use the clergyman preaching righteous fury from the pulpit. You use the politicians giving soaring speeches about saving civilization from the barbarians. It is a masterclass in psychological manipulation. You take a normal boy, you put him in a crisp uniform, you pin a badge on his chest, and you make him feel like a god. Then you put him on a boat. The moment that boat docks, the illusion evaporates. The brass bands disappear. The soaring speeches are instantly replaced by the relentless, deafening scream of artillery fire. The crisp uniform is immediately soaked in freezing rain, blood, and human waste. The boy from Ohio suddenly realizes that the glorious adventure is actually just an industrial slaughterhouse. And what is his compensation for this? Butler lays out the pathetic math. The soldier is paid roughly $30 a month, but he does not even see most of that. He is heavily pressured, almost forced, to send half of that money back home to his dependents because the government is absolutely not going to take care of his family while he's gone. Then he is required to buy his own life insurance. He literally has to pay out of his own meager salary for the privilege of making sure his mother is not entirely destitute when he is inevitably blown apart. By the time the deductions are finished, the kid sitting in a trench full of rats and mustard gas is making pennies a day. He is making less than the cost of a cheap meal back in Chicago. Meanwhile, the executive who manufactured the defective boots rotting off that soldier's feet is buying a third vacation estate. But the financial insult is just the superficial layer of the racket. The true cost is extracted from the human body. Butler takes us by the hand and walks us into the veterans' hospitals long after the treaties are signed. This is where the real bill is presented. The parades are over, the ticker tape has been swept up, the public has moved on, but in these sterile, quiet wards, the war has never ended. Butler describes visiting these rooms and seeing men whose minds were completely shattered by the concussive force of high explosives and the unendurable, grinding terror of trench warfare. He sees men who flinch uncontrollably at the sound of a dropped tray. He sees men who have not spoken a single word in years. He points to the boys who come back missing jaws, missing arms, missing eyes. The public does not want to look at them. The racket requires that the public ignores the carnage the moment the shooting stops. The men who survive, the ones who come back physically whole, find that the very jobs they left behind have evaporated. The factories that were desperate for their labor are now firing workers because the wartime contracts have dried up. The soldiers are handed a cheap ribbon, told they are heroes, and pushed out onto the breadlines. Butler forces us to understand a brutal economic reality. The bill for a war is never paid off at the peace conference. It is paid off over generations. It is paid off in the chronic pain of a shattered spine. It is paid off in the nightmares that tear a man from his sleep decades later. The inside group, the racketeers, they take their cash and they walk away completely clean. The entire physical, psychological, and spiritual debt of the conflict is dumped squarely onto the shoulders of the working class. So, we look at this towering, seemingly indestructible machine. We look at the broken bodies, the shattered minds, the massive wealth transfer, and the immediate question is, how do you break it? Because Butler does not just leave us drowning in the bleakness of the situation. He is a military tactician. When a tactician sees an enemy stronghold, he looks for the structural weaknesses, the load-bearing pillars that can be knocked out to bring the whole thing crashing down. Butler identifies 3 distinct steps to smash the racket. The first step goes straight for the throat of the entire enterprise. It targets the core motivation. Butler argues that before you draft a single 18-year-old boy off a farm, before you put a single rifle in a single hand, you must conscript capital. You conscript the industry, you conscript the wealth. He proposes a very simple, incredibly radical mathematical equation. You take the executive of the steel plant, the president of the munitions factory, the directors of the banks financing the war effort, and you cap their income. You mandate that not a single person working in a war industry, from the CEO down to the middle manager, can make more than the lowest paid soldier in the trenches. $30 a month. That is the ceiling. Imagine the absolute panic in the boardrooms if this were enacted. Butler wants you to visualize the president of a major naval shipyard being told that his compensation for the duration of the conflict is now exactly equal to the teenager sleeping in the mud at the front. You freeze all dividends. You freeze all corporate profits. The government takes control of the factories, the mines, the railroads, and they are run at cost. Butler knows exactly what would happen. He knows that the moment you remove the profit margin from a global conflict, the sudden burning patriotism of the industrial class will evaporate overnight. If the men pulling the strings cannot make a dime off the bloodshed, their enthusiasm for foreign intervention will drop to zero. You strip away the financial incentive, and the racket starves to death. But he does not stop there. The second step is a complete dismantling of how a war is legally declared. Historically and currently, the decision to go to war is made by a tiny, insulated group of older men. Politicians, diplomats, and executives sit in very quiet, very safe rooms in capital cities and vote to send young men to die. The people voting face absolutely no physical danger. They will not lose sleep, they will not go hungry, and they certainly will not have limbs blown off by artillery. Butler proposes a limited plebiscite, a national vote, but not everyone gets to vote. Only the people who are actually going to be shot at get to cast a ballot. If there is a proposed conflict, you don't let the president decide. You don't let Congress decide. You don't let the newspaper editors who are whipping up public hysteria decide. You put the question entirely in the hands of the military-aged citizens who will be drafted to fight it. If the 60-year-old senator wants a war, his vote doesn't count. The ballot belongs exclusively to the kids who will have to carry the rifles. Butler trusts the instinct of the people who pay the actual physical price. He believes that if you strip away the propaganda and give the decision directly to the soldiers, they will never, ever vote for an offensive war of choice. They will only vote to fight if there is a genuine, existential threat to their actual homes. Which brings us to his third and final step. You have to physically castrate the military machine. You have to ensure that even if a government wanted to launch an overseas imperial adventure, it mathematically and logistically cannot do it.
He demands a strictly defensive military posture. By law, you restrict the Navy. You dictate that naval vessels are not allowed to operate more than 200 miles off the coastline of the United States. You restrict the Army. You dictate that the standing army is strictly prohibited from leaving the territorial borders of the country. You build an armed forces that is heavily equipped to repel an invasion, but physically incapable of projecting power across an ocean to protect corporate investments in South America or Asia. If the Navy cannot cross the Atlantic, they cannot protect the shipping lanes for the munitions makers. If the Army cannot cross the Pacific, they cannot occupy a foreign capital to ensure a loan repayment for the banks. You turn the sword entirely into a shield. Butler is laying out a blueprint that attacks the racket from every conceivable angle. You remove the money so the string pullers lose interest. You restrict the vote to the victims so the politicians lose their power. You tether the military to the homeland so the empire loses its reach. We reach the final turn in the book, and here Butler does something that very few men of his stature have the psychological endurance to do. He turns the interrogation lamp completely around and shines it directly into his own eyes. He has spent the previous chapters dismantling the industrialists, the politicians, and the propagandists. Now, in his final synthesis, he has to dismantle his own legacy. He has to publicly confess his role as the premier enforcer of the racket. He looks back over 33 years of active service. He doesn't use the sterilized language of a military memoir. He speaks with the blunt force trauma of a man who is disgusted by his own reflection. He lists the operations, but he strips away the operational code names and the patriotic justifications. He tells us exactly what he was doing. He admits that he helped make Mexico, specifically Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1914. He helped make Haiti and Cuba decent, profitable places for the banking boys to collect revenues. He helped purify Nicaragua for the international banking houses from 1909 to 1912. He brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests in 1916. In China, he saw to it that the massive oil conglomerates went their way unmolested. Listen to the verbs he uses: making safe, purifying, bringing light. He is mocking the very rhetoric that was fed to him by his superiors. He realizes that he was never a knight-errant. He was, in his own agonizingly precise words, a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, and for the bankers. He was a gangster for capitalism. Think about the immense, crushing weight of that cognitive dissonance. Imagine dedicating your entire youth, your physical health, your blood, and your friends' lives to an institution, believing with absolute religious fervor that you were fighting for the survival of the Republic. Then, decades later, you look at the balance sheets, you look at the corporate charters. You realize the Republic was never in danger. The only thing in danger was the quarterly dividend of a sugar monopoly. Butler admits that during those years, he had suspicions. Like all men in the thick of it, he had moments where the pieces just didn't fit. But the military machine is designed to keep you moving. The constant deployments, the promotions, the brass bands, the medals, they act as a narcotic. They numb the critical mind. It wasn't until he retired, until he stepped out of the uniform and off the conveyor belt, that he could finally look at the entire scope of the operation. He looked at the shattered boys in the veterans' wards, and he looked at the swelling bank accounts of the munitions makers, and the narcotic finally wore off. And because the narcotic has worn off, he has absolutely zero patience for the polite, civilized attempts to regulate the racket. He attacks the international disarmament conferences of his era with vicious precision. He points out the fundamental absurdity of sending professional soldiers, admirals, and career diplomats to Geneva or London to negotiate an end to war. He tells us to look at who is actually sitting at those polished wooden tables. They are men whose entire careers, whose entire social standing, whose entire livelihoods depend on the continuation of the armed machine. Expecting them to genuinely disarm the world is like expecting a convention of oil executives to ban the combustion engine. It is never going to happen. Butler exposes these conferences for what they really are: union negotiations for the racketeers. They aren't trying to stop the killing, they're just trying to standardize the rules of the game so it doesn't get too expensive for the major players. They will passionately debate the allowable tonnage of a battleship, not because they care about human life, but because battleships are getting incredibly costly to manufacture, and they want to shift those investments into cheaper, more efficient tools of destruction, like submarines and poison gas. They're simply restructuring the portfolio of death. For Butler, there is no reforming the system. You cannot regulate a racket. You cannot ask the mob nicely to take a smaller cut of the protection money. You have to destroy it. You have to smash it using the 3 structural steps he laid out: conscripting the wealth to kill the profit motive, limiting the vote to the men who will bleed, and tethering the military to the homeland. His final, enduring message is not a polite plea for peace. It is a primal, furious scream from a man who has seen the absolute worst of human exploitation from the very inside of the beast. It is a definitive, uncompromising line drawn in the sand, stripping away every illusion of glory to leave only the brutal truth. We step out of the 1930s now. Butler dies in 1940, completely exhausted by his crusade. He never sees the Second World War. He never sees the atomic bomb. He never sees the Cold War, the proxy wars, or the endless interventions of the 21st century. But if you take this thin little book, this furious pamphlet he wrote, and you lay it over the last 80 years of our geopolitical landscape, it is terrifying how perfectly it matches the terrain. The mechanics he described did not disappear. They simply evolved. 26 years after Butler published his book, another decorated general stood at a podium to deliver his farewell address to the nation: Dwight D. Eisenhower. He warned the American public about the exact same machinery, though he used a slightly more polite institutional phrase. He called it the military-industrial complex. Eisenhower was looking at the exact same ledger books Butler was looking at. He just saw that the racket had moved out of the smoke-filled back rooms and become a permanent, structurally integrated part of the national economy. Let us apply Butler's framework to the modern era. The core mechanism, the socialization of cost and the privatization of profit, is not just intact, it is optimized. Look at the nature of the inside group today. In Butler's time, it was the steel magnates and the shoe manufacturers temporarily pivoting to wartime production. Today, the inside group never pivots. We have built a permanent war economy. The massive defense contractors, the aerospace corporations, the private military firms, they do not manufacture civilian goods and then switch to artillery shells when a conflict breaks out. Their entire business model, their fiduciary duty to their shareholders, relies entirely on a continuous state of armed conflict, or at the very least, the perpetual threat of it. The products have changed. They are not selling defective mosquito netting or obsolete saddles anymore. They are selling precision-guided munitions. They are selling autonomous drone technology. They are selling massive multi-billion-dollar fighter jet programs that take decades to develop and are largely obsolete by the time they are operational. They are selling private logistical support, effectively outsourcing the basic functions of the military to private corporations who operate with almost zero public oversight. But the profit margins, the staggering transfer of wealth from the public treasury to private bank accounts, that remains exactly the same. Butler warned us about how the propaganda isolates the public from the reality of the violence. Today, that isolation is nearly absolute. We do not have a draft, we have an all-volunteer force. This is a crucial mutation in the racket. By removing the draft, you remove the immediate visceral threat to the middle and upper classes. When the children of the politicians and the corporate executives are no longer at risk of being pulled out of college and sent to a combat zone, the political friction required to start a war drops to zero. The public is insulated. We experience conflict through sterilized press briefings, satellite imagery, and algorithmic news feeds. We do not see the physical toll, but that toll is still being extracted. Instead of mustard gas and trench foot, the modern soldier returns with traumatic brain injuries from improvised explosive devices. They return with profound moral injury and psychological trauma from navigating asymmetrical, endless counterinsurgencies. And just as Butler walked through the quiet, forgotten wards of the veterans' hospitals in the 1920s, today we have an entire generation of veterans navigating an overwhelmed, bureaucratic healthcare system, carrying the physical and psychological debts of conflicts that the general public has largely forgotten about. The financial cost of these modern interventions is no longer measured in millions, it is measured in trillions. Trillions of dollars borrowed, adding to a staggering national debt, effectively taxing generations that have not even been born yet. The cost is entirely socialized. Think about Butler's first step to smash the machine, conscripting capital. Imagine proposing that today. Imagine proposing that the CEO of a top 5 defense contracting firm must have their compensation capped at the exact salary of an E-1 private for the duration of a military engagement. Imagine freezing the stock buybacks and the dividends of the entire defense sector the moment troops are deployed. The sheer impossibility of that idea in our current political climate shows you exactly how deeply entrenched the racket is. The lobbyists would crush the legislation before the ink was dry. The think tanks, largely funded by those same defense contractors, would instantly produce highly polished white papers explaining why such a move would critically endanger national security. The closed-loop system Butler identified has become a fortress. This is the enduring, brutal legacy of Smedley Butler. He forces us to look past the rhetoric of foreign policy and look directly at the math. He demands we ask the fundamental question every time the drums are beating, every time the politicians look gravely into a camera and talk about necessary interventions. He demands we ask who is paying the bill and who is collecting the check.